All right, well, now we turn our attention to the last component of memory, and it has to do with forgetting. Memory construction and improving memory. And I would mention to you, interestingly enough, that we have a few references, even in Scripture, about memory. God often talks about not remembering our sin anymore, or Paul talking about forgetting the past and striving toward what is ahead. And forgetting is an interesting topic, actually, because in God's case, what's rendered in Scripture is not remembering. In other words, a choice not to remember our sin, which is really quite a powerful concept. The other part of that is Paul talking about forgetting, and it's not, the forgetting that Paul talks about is not necessarily what we're going to be talking about here. He wasn't trying to be precise as a psychologist or anything of the sort. So when we actually talk about forgetting, let's talk about, first of all, why we actually forget. And actually the capacity to forget is a useless, or really, is not a useless concept. The capacity to forget useless or out-of-date information is actually quite helpful. It's kind of a creative destruction of information within us. And we look at a variety of things to understand how forgetting actually occurs. And this particular gentleman to the left here is a guy by the name of H.M. He is a well-known patient in the memory world, and partly because he suffered from something we refer to as retrograde amnesia. In other words, he had a certain amount of memory up to a point, and then after that point he couldn't recall anything. And a classic, not a classic, but an example of this, if you want to watch the movie Memento, Guy Pearce actually portrays a man with retrograde amnesia. So the reality is that without the capacity to forget some things, we would be absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of information we would have at our disposal. So we have to be able to organize, to generalize and evaluate information in terms of what's worth remembering and what isn't. And actually, when we talked about effortful encoding, that would be a good example of that. So retrograde amnesia has to do with new memories and the inability to remember or to encode new memories. And retrograde amnesia, so I'm going to put that in there, but retrograde amnesia is something a little bit different in the sense that it refers to the inability to recall the past. And if you've ever had surgery, the actual medication that they use in surgery is meant to induce a retrograde amnesia just prior to going into surgery. Oftentimes we refer to that as a sunset drug, if you will. It puts you into a drowsy state, and essentially you don't really process anything until you come out of surgery, and you don't remember any of the surgery, obviously. So that's part of the aspect of forgetting, as we look at people that can't process new memories, which is retrograde, and then retrograde amnesia itself, looking at it and not being able to remember a certain portion of our past at all. Now, you can have concussions, other head injuries that sometimes you'll have an impact on. You will have amnesia, if you will, head injuries. When I look at or try to recall some portion of my injury when I fell off a roof and had a head injury. I have only really patchy memories, and that would be a good example of retrograde amnesia. My memory is intact except for during that period of time of my life when I went through it. So the aspect of that is key to remember, that we can process information, understand it, but there are disruptions in it that result in this. So if you've ever had the notion that forgetting or amnesia occurs because of a blow to the head, it's partially right. It's not entirely right, but it certainly is partially right. So when we're actually talking about forgetting, we're actually talking about two different processes, okay? We're talking about an encoding failure, which is referred to over there on the right. And essentially, how I encode something has everything to do with whether I would be able to remember something. So as it comes in, it goes into working short-term memory, and then during this encoding phase, something happens and leads to forgetting. And so what ends up actually getting into memory, long-term memory, is less than what was started with over here in working memory itself. So the encoding failure is a key, and some of it has everything to do with what we pay attention to. So it's focus and attention is key in encoding and in encoding failure as well. So if you've ever had this feeling when you go into a test and you realize I studied all the wrong things, essentially it may not be that you didn't look at the stuff that you're being asked to recall, but essentially your focus and attention wasn't on it, and therefore the encoding failure occurs. So encoding failure is one big concept which is key to remember. The other big concept is pictured here with this particular graph, and it's something we refer to as storage decay. And there was a gentleman by the name of Ebbinghaus that actually explored this in some degree of detail, and essentially with the whole idea behind storage decay is that we basically store things, and what you see at the front end of this diagram over here is that we have a high degree of recall for a period of time, and then it drops precipitously. And then once it hits a certain level, then it levels off over time. And that's what we refer to as storage decay. Essentially what Ebbinghaus did was he memorized nonsense syllables is how he went about doing it, because he figured that if he memorized things that had no particular meaning, he could have a more clear measure of memory itself. But essentially what he found was the actual course of forgetting, course of forgetting essentially drops, like I already mentioned to you, drops precipitously at the front end, and then it levels off, drops and then levels off over time. And a lot of times you'll see that in a lot of different situations. A good example would be when people learned high school Spanish. And what you see is that the retention does exactly the same thing. It drops and it levels off. And so even 10, 20, 30 years later, what we see is we see still a certain amount of stuff remembered later on. And so one of the examples of that was I was fairly proficient at Spanish throughout college, but because of the lack of usage and later on I took a trip to Venezuela, and I had to try to recall some of the Spanish that I had learned. And what ended up happening was it was quite patchy, that my learning of the Spanish, but I still had some elements in it that were still in there that I could still use, some really basic concepts and things that are part of that. So the key concept, like I mentioned here, is the idea of storage decay and Ebbinghaus and his nonsense syllables, and how it actually occurs. Retention drops precipitously, and then it levels off over time.